the World by J.M. Roberts. Book 8 The Latest Age. Chapter 3 Crumbling Certainties. Two Europes. Further institutions emerged. In 1952, a European defense community formalized West Germany's military position. This was to be replaced by German membership of NATO, but a major thrust towards greater unity, as before, was economic. The crucial step came in 1957. The European Economic Community then came into being when France, Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Italy joined in signing the Treaty of Rome. Besides looking forward to the creation of a common market embracing its members, within which barriers to the free movement of goods, services, and labor were to be removed, and with a common tariff, the treaty also provided for a decision making authority, a bureaucracy, and a European Parliament with advisory powers. Some spoke of the reconstitution of Charlemagne's heritage. It spurred countries which had not joined the European Economic Community to set up their own, looser and more limited European Free Trade Association. 2.5 years later, in 1986, the six countries of the original European Economic Commission, by then it had become simply the EC, the word economic significantly had been dropped, were 12, while European Free Trade Association had lost all but four of its members to it. 5 years later, still, and what was left of the European Free Trade Association was envisaging merging with the European Commission. Western Europe's slow but accelerating movement towards a modicum of political unity demonstrated the confidence of those who made the arrangements that armed conflict could never again be an acceptable alternative to cooperation and negotiation between their countries. Tragically, though, recognizing that fact, Great Britain's government did not seize the chance to join in, giving it institutional expression later. It was twice to be refused admission to the European Economic Commission. Meanwhile, the community's interests were steadily cemented together by a common agricultural policy, which was to all intents and purposes a huge bribe to the farmers and peasants who were so important a part of the German and French electorates, and later to those of poorer countries as they became members. For a long time, determined opposition to further integration at the political as opposed to the economic level came from France. It was expressed strongly by General de Gaulle, who returned to politics in 1958 to become the president when the Fourth French Republic seemed likely to slide into civil war over Algeria. His first task was to negotiate these rapids and to carry through important constitutional reforms, which created the Fifth Republic. His next service to France was as great as any in his wartime career, the liquidation of her Algerian commitment in 1961. The legions came home, some disgruntled. The act freed both him and his country for a more vigorous international role, though a somewhat negative one. De Gaulle's view of European consolidation was limited to cooperation between independent nation states. He saw the European Economic Committee as, above all, a way of protecting French economic interests. He was quite prepared to strain the new organization badly to get his way. Further, he, in effect, twice vetoed British applications to join it. Wartime experience had left de Gaulle with deep distrust of the Anglo Saxons and a belief, by no means ill founded, that the British still hankered after integration with an Atlantic community embracing the United States rather than with continental Europe. In 1964, he annoyed the Americans by exchanging diplomatic representatives with Communist China. He insisted that France go ahead with her own nuclear weapons program, declining to be dependent on American patronage. Finally, after causing it much trouble, he withdrew from NATO. This could be seen as the coming of polycentricism to the Western Bloc when de Gaulle resigned after an unfavorable referendum in 1969, a major political force making for uncertainty and disarray in Western Europe disappeared. Great Britain finally joined the European Economic Committee in 1973, a registration at last of the facts of 20th century history by the most conservative of the historic nation states. The decision complemented the withdrawal from empire and acknowledged that the British strategic frontier lay no longer on the Rhine but on the Elbe. It was a significant turning point, though far from conclusive. In an era of uncertainty, for a quarter century, British governments had tried and failed to combine economic growth, increased social service provision, and a high level of employment. The second depended ultimately on the first, but when difficulty arose, the first had always been sacrificed to the other two. The United Kingdom was, after all, a democracy whose voters, greedy and gullible, had to be placated. The vulnerability of the traditional British economy's commitment to international trade was a handicap too. Other handicaps lay in its old staple industries, starved of investment, and the deeply conservative attitudes of the people. Though the United Kingdom grew richer, in 1970, virtually no British manual worker had 4 weeks paid holiday a year, and 10 years later, a third of them did. It fell more and more behind other developed countries, both in its wealth and its rate of creating it. If the British had managed a decline in the international power and the achievement of a rapid decolonization without the violence and domestic bitterness visible elsewhere, it remained unclear whether they could shake off the past in other ways and ensure them even a modest prosperity as a second rank nation. One obvious and symptomatic threat to order and civilization was posed in the Northern Ireland. Protestant and Catholic hooligans alike seemed bent on destroying their homeland rather than cooperating with their rivals and caused the deaths of thousands of British citizens, soldiers, policemen, and civilians. Protestant and Catholic, Irish, Scottish, and English alike, in the 1970s and 1980s. Fortunately, they did not disrupt British party politics as Irishmen had done in the past. The British electorate remained preoccupied rather by material concerns. Inflation ran at unprecedented levels. The annualized rate 1970 to 80 was over 13% and gave new edge to industrial troubles in the 1970s, especially in the wake of the oil crisis. There was speculation about whether the country was ungovernable as a minor strike brought down one government. While many leaders and interpreters of opinion seemed obsessed with the themes of social division, even the question whether the United Kingdom should remain in the European Economic Committee, which was submitted to the revolutionary device of a referendum in June 1975, was put in these terms. It was therefore all the more surprising to many politicians when the outcome was unambiguously favorable to continued membership. Nonetheless, more bad times, economically speaking, lay immediately ahead. Inflation in 1975, running at 26.9% in the wake of the oil crisis, was at last identified by government as the overriding threat. Wage demands by trade unions were anticipating inflation still to come, and it began to dawn on some that the era of unquestioned growth in consumption was over. There was a gleam of light. A few years earlier, vast oil fields had been discovered under the seabed of the coasts of northern Europe. In 1976, the United Kingdom became an oil exporting nation. That did not help much immediately in the same year. A loan from the International Monetary Fund was required. When Mrs. Thatcher, the country's and Europe's first female prime minister and the first woman to lead a major political party, the Conservatives, took office in 1979, she had, in a sense, little to lose. Her opponents were discredited, as were the ideas many felt that had been long accepted uncritically as the determinants of British policy. A radical new departure for once really did seem to be a possibility. To the surprise of many and the amazement of some among both her supporters and her opponents, that is exactly what Mrs. Thatcher was to provide after a shaky start to what was to prove the longest tenure of power of any British Prime Minister in the 20th century. Not far into her premiership, she found herself in 1982 presiding unexpectedly over what may well prove to have been Great Britain's last colonial war. The conquest of the Falkland Islands after their brief occupation by Argentine forces was, in logistic terms alone, a great feat of arms as well as a major psychological and diplomatic success. The Prime Minister's instincts to fight for the principles of international law and for the islanders' right to say by whom they should be governed were well attuned to the popular mood. She also correctly judged the international possibilities. After an uncertain start, unsurprising, given its traditional sensitivity over Latin America, the United States provided important practical and clandestine help. Chile, by no means easy with her restive neighbor, was not disposed to object to British covert operations on the mainland of South America. More important, most of the European Committee countries supported the isolation of Argentina in the United Nations and resolutions that condemned the Argentine action. It was especially notable that the British had, from the start, the support, not often offered to them so readily, of the French government, which knew a threat to vested rights when it saw one. It now seems clear that Argentinian action had been encouraged by the misleading impressions of likely British reactions gained from British diplomacy in previous years. For this reason, the British Foreign Secretary resigned at the outset of the crisis. Happily, one political consequence was the fatal wounding in its prestige and cohesiveness of the military regime that ruled Argentina and its replacement at the end of 1983 by a constitutional and elected government. In the United Kingdom, Mrs. Thatcher's prestige rose with national morale. Abroad, too, her standing was enhanced, and this was important. For the rest of the decade, it provided the country with an influence with other heads of state, notably the American president, which the raw facts of British strength could scarcely have sustained by themselves. Not everyone agreed that this influence was always advantageous deployed. Like those of General de Gaulle, Mrs. Thatcher's personal convictions, preconceptions, and prejudices were always very visible, and she, like him, was no European, if that meant allowing emotional or even practical commitment to Europe to blunt personal visions of national interest. At home, meanwhile, she transformed the terms of British politics and perhaps of cultural and social debate, dissolving a long established Jan Ponson consensus about national goals. This, together with the undoubted radicalism of many of her specific policies, awoke both enthusiasm and an unusual animosity. Yet she failed to achieve some of her important aims. 10 years after she took up office, government was playing a greater, not a smaller role in many areas of society, and the public money spent on health and social security had gone up a third in real terms since 1979, without satisfying greatly increased demand. Although Mrs. Thatcher had led the Conservatives to three general election victories in a row, a unique achievement in British politics up to then, many in her party came to believe she would be a vote loser in the next contest, which could not be far away. Faced with erosion of loyalty and support, she resigned in 1990, leaving to her successor rising unemployment and a bad financial situation. But it seemed likely that British policy might now become less obstructive in its approach to the community and its affairs and less rhetorical about it. The 1970s had been difficult years for all the members of the European Economic Committee. Growth fell away and individual economies reeled under the impact of the oil crisis. This contributed to institutional bickering and squabbling, particularly on economic and financial matters, which had reminded Europeans of the limits to what was so far achieved. It continued in the 1980s and, coupled with uneasiness about the success of the Far Eastern economic sphere, dominated by Japan, and a growing realization that other nations would wish to join the ten, led to a further crystallization of ideas about the community's future. Many Europeans saw more clearly that greater unity, a habit of cooperation, and an increasing prosperity were prerequisites of Europe's political independence. But some also felt an emerging sense that such independence would always remain hollow unless Europe, too, could turn herself into a superpower. Comfort could be drawn by enthusiasts from further progress in integration. In 1979, the first direct elections to European Parliament were already being held. Greece in 1981, Spain and Portugal in 1986 were soon to join the community. In 1987, the foundations of a common European currency and monetary system were drawn up, although the United Kingdom did not agree, and it was settled that 1992 should be the year which would see the inauguration of a genuine single market across whose national borders goods, people, capital, and services were to move freely. Members even endorsed in principle the idea of European political union, although the British and French had notable misgivings. This by no means made at once for greater psychological cohesion and comfort as the implications emerged, but it was an indisputable sign of development of some sort. In the years since the Treaty of Rome, Western Europe had come a very long way, further perhaps than was always grasped by men and women born and grown to maturity under it. Underlying the institutional changes, too, were slowly growing similarities in politics, social structure, consumption habits, and beliefs about values and goals. Even the old disparities of economic structure had greatly diminished as the decline in numbers and increase in prosperity of French and German farmers showed. On the other hand, new problems had presented themselves as poorer and perhaps politically less stable countries had joined the European Committee. That there had been huge convergences could not be contested. What was still unclear was what might this imply for the future. New challenges to the Cold War world order. In December 1975, Gerald Ford became the second American president to visit China. The adjustment of his country's deep seated distrust and hostility towards the People's Republic had begun with the slow recognition of the lessons of Vietnam. On the Chinese side, change was a part of an even greater development. China's resumption of an international and regional role appropriate to her historic stature and potential. This could only come to fruition after 1949, and by the mid 1970s, it was complete. An approach towards establishing normal relations with the United States was now possible. Formal recognition of what had already been achieved came in 1978. In a Sino American agreement, the United States made the crucial concession that its forces should be withdrawn from Taiwan and that official diplomatic relations with the island's KMT government should be ended. Mao had died in September 1976. The threat of the ascendancy of a gang of four of his coadjutors, one was his widow, who had prompted the policies of the Cultural Revolution, was quickly averted by their arrest and eventually trial and condemnation in 1981. Under new leadership dominated by party veterans, it soon became clear that the excesses of the Cultural Revolution were to be corrected. In 1977, they rejoined the government as a vice premier, the twice previously disgraced Deng Xiaoping, firmly associated with the contrary trend. His son had been crippled by beatings from the Red Guards in the Cultural Revolution. The most important change, though, was that China's long awaited economy recovery was at last attainable. Scope was now to be given to individual enterprise and profit motive, and economic links with non communist countries were to be encouraged. The aim was to resume the process of technological and industrial modernization. The major definition of the new course was undertaken in 1981 at the plenary session of the Central Committee of the party that met that year. It undertook, too, the delicate task of distinguishing the positive achievements of Mao, a great proletarian revolutionary, from what it now identified as his gross mistakes and his responsibility for the setbacks of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. For all the comings and goings in the CCP leadership and the mysterious debates and sloganizing which continued to obscure political realities, and although Deng Xiaoping and his associates had to work through a collective leadership that included conservatives, the 1980s were to be shaped by a new current. Modernization had at last been given precedence over Marxist socialism, even if that could hardly be said aloud. When the Secretary General of the party pronounced in 1986 the incautious and amazing judgment that Marx and Lenin cannot solve our problems, he was soon dismissed. Marxist language still pervaded the rhetoric of government. Some said China was resuming the capitalist road. This too was obscuring, though natural. There persisted in the party and government a clear grasp of the need for positive planning of the economy. But there was a new recognition of practical limits and a willingness to try to discriminate more carefully between what was and what was not within the scope of effective regulation in the pursuit of the major goals of economic and national strength, the improvement of living standards, and a broad egalitarianism. One remarkable change was that agriculture was virtually privatized in the next few years, in the sense that, although they were not given the freeholds of their land, peasants were encouraged to sell produce freely in the markets. New slogans, "To get rich is glorious," was coined to encourage the development of village industrial and commercial enterprise, and a pragmatic road to development was signposted with four modernizations. Special economic areas, enclaves for free trade with the capitalist world, were set up. The first at Canton, the historic center of Chinese trade with the West. It was not a policy without costs. Grain production fell at first. Inflation began to show itself in early 1980s, and foreign debt rose. Some blamed the growing visibility of crime and corruption on the new line. Yet, of its economic successes, there can be no doubt. Mainland China began in the 1980s to show that perhaps an economic miracle like that of Taiwan was within her grasp. By 1986, she was the second largest producer of coal in the world and the fourth largest of steel. GDP rose at more than 10% a year between 1978 and 1986, while industrial output had doubled in value in that time. Per capita peasant income nearly tripled, and by 1988, the average peasant family was estimated to have about 6 months' income in the savings bank. Taking a longer perspective, the contrasts are even more striking for all the damage done by the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. The value of foreign trade multiplied roughly 25 times in per capita terms between 1950 and the middle of 1980s. The social benefits that have accompanied such changes are also clear. Increased food consumption and life expectancy, a virtual end to many of the fatal and crippling diseases of the old regime, and a huge inroad into mass illiteracy. China's continuing population growth was alarming and prompted vigorous measures of intervention, but it had not, as had India's, devoured the fruits of economic development. The new line specifically linked modernization to strength. Thus, it reflected the aspirations of China's reformers ever since the May 4th movement and of some even earlier. China's international weight had already been apparent in the 1950s. It was now beginning to show itself in different ways. In 1984 came agreement with the British over terms for the reincorporation of Hong Kong in 1977 on the expiration of the lease covering some of its territories. A later agreement with the Portuguese provided for the resumption of Macau too. It was a blemish on the general recognition of China's due standing that among its neighbors, Vietnam, with which China's relations at one time disintegrated into open warfare when the two countries were rivals for the control of Cambodia, remained hostile. But the Taiwanese were somewhat reassured by Chinese promises that the reincorporation of the island into the territory of the Republic in due course would not endanger its economic system. Similar assurances were given over Hong Kong, like the establishment of special trading enclaves on the mainland, where external commerce could flourish. Such statements underlined the importance China's new rulers attached to commerce as a channel of modernization. China's sheer size gave such a policy direction importance over a wide area. By 1985, the whole East and Southeast Asia constituted a trading zone of unprecedented potential. Within it, new centers of industrial and commercial activities were developing so fast in the 1980s as to justify by themselves the view that the old global balance of economic power had disappeared. South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore had all shed the aura of undeveloped economies. Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia by 1990 looked as if they were moving up rapidly to join them. Their success was part of the East Asia as a whole, and Japan had been indispensable to this outcome. The rapidity with which Japan, like China, recovered its former status as a power and surpassed it had obvious implications for its place both in the Asian and the world balance. In 1959, Japanese exports again reached pre-war levels. By 1970, the Japanese had the second highest GDP in the non-communist world. They had renewed their industrial base and had moved with great success into new areas of manufacture. Only in 1951 did a Japanese yard launch the country's first ship built for export. 25 years later, Japan had the largest shipbuilding industry in the world. At the same time, it took a commanding position in consumer industries such as electronics and motor cars, of which Japan made more than any country except the United States. This caused resentment among American manufacturers, the supreme compliment. In 1979, it was agreed that Japanese cars should be made in England, the beginning of their entry into the European Economic Community market. The debit side of this account was provided by a fast growing population and by the ample evidence of the cost of economic growth in the destruction of the Japanese environment and the wear and tear of urban life.